Hi, everyone. Hope that this message finds you well this week as we do another edition of our YouTube Drasha series. This week's Parsha, this week, we read about our freedom. We achieve our freedom. The last of the Eser Makos, the 10 plagues, takes place. We have our matzah, and we're ready to go. We're ready to embark on this journey to the promised land. This freedom, explains Rabbi Soloveitchik Zatzal, has within it, according to the Jewish version, the Torah's definition, chesed and gvura, kindness and strength. And he explains in his essay how they're really two sides of the same coin, which we'll explain now. One example of strength, of course, is Paro. Paro is the king of the world. And we see how he uses his strength. We see how he fails in his test of kindness. How so? Rashi tells us this week, and this is part of my interpretation of Rabbi Soloveitchik's Torah. Rashi tells us this week that Paro stays in bed, that he's told all the firstborn are going to die in Egypt. And Rashi tells us Paro gets up out of bed to go get Moshe and Aaron in order to end this plague. Makas Bechoros. So commentaries on Rashi want to know, why does Rashi tell us that he gets up out of bed? The fact that he's getting up is indicating that he's in bed. The fact that he's coming from his bed to go get Moshe and Aaron seems to be extraneous, unimportant. But the answer is that he was so callous and he did not care about the death and destruction of his own people. He was able to get ready for a good night's sleep, even though there had been 9 plagues, everything came to fruition. He knew there was a good likelihood it was going to happen. When it started to impact himself, he got up, but he was ready to go to sleep for the night, even the night of Makas Bechoros. And indeed, there are other contrasts in terms of how we acted and how some of our adversaries or other nations have acted. Rabbi Soloveitchik contrasts it also with Romans. How did the slaves in Rome act when they were freed? They ransacked the city. They took vengeance upon their taskmasters, upon those who had persecuted him. And he goes into detail talking about history, the Cossacks in Ukraine. And he says, look what happened to the Jewish people. They had their boys thrown in the Nile River. They had their babies murdered. They were tortured. They were whipped. They were treated subhuman for centuries on end. And what did they do? Did they set fire to the city as they left town? Did they go ahead and take out their machetes and hack their oppressors to death? No. They locked themselves in their houses. They said thank you to the Almighty. On the original night of Purim, they said Hallel, some form, you could say, primitive form of the Haggadah. They had the Korban Pesach as they were instructed, and they were involved in a profound appreciation that they now have well-being, physical well-being, mental well-being, and freedom, and a radical freedom. And they provided a lesson for all of us about how to use that radical freedom. They had the strength. They had the strength to withdraw from any more base animalistic tendencies or parts of their persona. They didn't go around loading or taking revenge or anything of the sort. They had seen the Makos for themselves. They experienced it. They said, what does that mean for us? The fact that we were privy to have these miracles wrought on our behalf. We are going to hold ourselves to a higher standard. We are going to be strong and desist from acts of violence, wanton acts of violence, because our freedom is already here, despite whatever anger we might have. And acts of kindness. We'll give an example of that in a moment. So why is matzah called lechem oni, the bread of our affliction? The night of Pesach, we're celebrating our geula, this redemption. The Almighty has unshackled us. We are excited to have the ability to clinch our own destiny, to make our own plans, and to go to the land of Israel and follow the Torah. Why is it called the bread of our affliction? And what is the affliction? Rabbi Soloveitchik suggests the affliction was that it wasn't easy for them to hold back. It wasn't easy for them to say to themselves, we now have the upper hand. But they had to make sure that they were able to be fully redeemed. They didn't define themselves anymore by the Egyptians. We have our freedom. We're not going to be defined by the trauma that we experience. We will no longer let the Egyptians define who we are. And instead, they achieved this radical independence, the ultimate emancipation, because they realized that if they took revenge, now that they had their freedom, they would still somehow be tied to these Egyptians. Instead, you know what? We're going to recoil, retreat, remove ourselves from Egyptian society, attach ourselves to the Almighty, forego any kind of vengeance, and we will not use our own body, our own lives, and waste our time on the past and on trying to get back the people who hurt us so much. That was difficult for them. And the affliction was that it was something that they wanted to do, but they were able to overcome that urge. And so that is one of the explanations of why matzah is called lechem oni. Just to share another act of kindness, an amazing act of kindness from the original Jewish people, the generation that received the Torah. You know what they did, says the Netziv, famous commentary from Tully Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. The Netziv explains that during the plague of darkness, we are told that the darkness was a tangible, a substantive darkness. So you were stricken. You couldn't move anywhere. It was so dark, you didn't want to go anywhere because you couldn't see a thing. If you were an Egyptian, you couldn't move. So he asked the obvious question. How did they survive 3 days without food? How come there weren't more deaths? How come the frail and the weak in Egypt, how come their bodies didn't pile up? They must have been famished, starving. He said, you know how they survived? They survived by the Jewish people who were able to see, due to the miracle of the plague at the time. The Jewish people went to their Egyptian neighbors and actually fed them. They gave them sustenance. When it was dark, they provided them with food. The Jewish people were saying, you know what it means to have freedom? When we have freedom, we can choose what kind of humanity we would like to exhibit. You know what it means to empower a Jew? The original Jews said, it means that we can make the world better. We're going to give you, our slave masters, our murderers, our oppressors, food. Because we're going to show you what we can do with our freedom. That is radical. It is revolutionary. It is certainly difficult and painful. And Netziv explains they were the ones who provided the nutrition, the sustenance during those 3 days of Choshech. And he says, how do you know that's true? How do you know that happened? He says, look at the continuation of chapter 11. He says, look at chapter 11, verse 3. There was a grace. The eyes of the Egyptians, it says, had a certain grace, had a certain affinity, affection for the Almighty and the Almighty's people. Right after this plague of darkness is a wild concept. So when we think of freedom, when we think of everything going on in our country, when we think of what it means to be powerful, we realize that the Jewish experience, the Torah experience, the lesson, the message of our Sedra and our Torah is that freedom Freedom means chesed and gvura. Freedom means kindness and strength. To be intentional and to be better for ourselves, to appreciate the fact that freedom doesn't mean that we have less responsibility. Freedom means we have more responsibility. So this is the message in Parshas Bo. I want to encourage everybody, please come to our event on Monday night as we discuss more of the details, the current events as it pertains to anti-Semitism, how powerful it is to have International Holocaust Remembrance Day during these parshas, these weeks, when we had the end of our original slavery. Thankfully, we achieved that freedom, never again to go back to Egypt or to be enslaved as a people in mass. And we have been able to keep that freedom, sometimes with great difficulty and challenge. We've been able to maintain this identity ever since this emancipation thousands of years ago. Thank you and have a great Shabbos.